It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural lecture. As you can imagine, as Master of Birkbeck, I get to welcome people to numerous inaugural lectures, rarely, though, with an audience as large as this, which has, of course, meant that we have had to move off the Birkbeck campus into this distinguished University of London building that, of course, many of you will know was designated as Nazi headquarters should the invasion of Britain have proved successful, perhaps highly appropriate, therefore, as a venue for this evening's lecture. It's really a tremendous pleasure to have this lecture now and to think about this, because we've been thinking about this Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism for a number of years. I was trying during the afternoon to reflect how many summer holidays ago it was that I actually took the first proposal away with me, and it was around 5 or 6 years ago. Since we had the idea that there was a great deal going on at Birkbeck which was relevant to the study of anti-Semitism across all sorts of areas, from history to law, psychosocial studies, politics, and so on. And I'm also very pleased that that strength here will be further enhanced with the move of the Wiener Library onto the Birkbeck campus next year. And if you happen to pass Russell Square this evening, you will see outside number 29 the hoardings and scaffolding there as they prepare the building for the Wiener, something that will strengthen our activities tremendously. So we had an idea that we ought to do this, and we had a vision, but it was a vision which we very much shared at a very early stage with the Pears Foundation. And I'm delighted that the Pears family, and Trevor Pears in particular, who we've been working with throughout that period, are here this evening, because they really shared and helped us to define the vision of this institute as something that would seriously study anti-Semitism in an academic context and look at its relationship to other forms of racial and religious hatred, to try and study, research, but also to teach, to engage publicly. And so we set out on our search for the director of the Institute. Not an easy task to find somebody who combines academic standing with the ability to lead and administer an institute and develop its vision. We had very many excellent candidates, but I think we were unanimous in choosing David Feldman and in seeing how he fulfilled those criteria. Academically excellent, of course, in a long career at Birkbeck. His book, Englishmen and Jews, is a standard work on the subject, but also able to lead, a leader in the School of History as a former head of department, and also someone who can develop and lead the Institute. His vision document, which was presented to the Management Committee last week, has set the tone for how the Institute will go forward. So for all these reasons, it's a great delight to me to invite David Feldman to deliver his inaugural lecture as Professor of History and Director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. David Feldman.
Thank you very much, David. I was alarmed this morning looking at the Birkbeck website. On the website, our wonderful website, the wonderful web people have put Professor David Feldman, the Jewish problem. Word gets around, what can one say? Well, despite the contemporary and historical significance of anti-Semitism, the Pears Institute stands as the only centre in the United Kingdom whose mission it is to promote the understanding of anti-Semitism. And it's one of only 2 such centres in the whole of Europe. Its very foundation, therefore, is an achievement, though one that must be the platform for others. And so it is with a sense of excitement and responsibility that I find myself the Institute's first director on the occasion of its launch today. The Institute, as David Latchman has said, is located in the School of Social Science, History and Philosophy, and more broadly it belongs to the college as a whole at Birkbeck. It will be a centre open to many disciplines, as well as to work that traverses disciplinary boundaries. But for 16 years, My professional home at Birkbeck has been in the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology. And I would just like to take this opportunity to say what a wonderful experience it has been working there with, and I think it's a mark of how lucky I was to end up there, that at conferences one would go and you say, where do you work? And then at Birkbeck in history. And one would get this sort of mix of congratulation and envy. And it was well-merited envy, because in terms of academic excellence and collegiality, and in terms of the students that we have, it really is a remarkable place. One of the marks of the department has been its commitment to public engagement, even before that term was coined and became fashionable. And so it is in that tradition of history which engages with public and political issues that I want to speak today. And in doing so, and before I do so, I just want to acknowledge one other debt, which is to Gareth Stedman-Jones, who was my undergraduate teacher, my PhD supervisor, and now friend. And I have learned much from him, but not least that a historical practice and political engagement are eminently compatible, but at the same time, historians should not shrink from questioning the mythologies nurtured by the causes they support. And it's in that spirit that I want to deliver my lecture this evening. And I want to begin with the story of the photographs you see in front of you. The photographs date from 1885 and are one of a series developed by the distinguished Victorian scientist Francis Galton. From the late 1870s, Galton developed the method he termed composite photography. The composite photograph was created by taking a series of portrait images of different individuals and superimposing one on top of the other. Galton's idea was that the discrepant features would blur out while the common characteristics intensify one another and produce a type of all the components. So all of those small a's that you see in front of you become the composite large A, and so forth. He applied his technique to families, criminals, the chronically sick, and to Jews. Composite photography, he hoped, would provide a method for discovering whether physiognomy is correlated with mental traits. This photograph presents what Galton labeled the Jewish type. Not only Galton, but the photograph itself achieved considerable fame. As Galton's former student and his biographer Carl Pearson observed in 1924, everyone knows the Jewish boy. In common with many other Victorian scientists, Galton was on a quest for the biological foundations of human society. His study of physiognomy and his attempt to match physical attributes with social behavior was central to this larger project. In 1883, he invented the term eugenics. He defined the new science as one that deals with all the influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race. A year later, Galton noted the connection between the Jewish race and their social behavior. The Jews are specialized, he explained, for a parasitical existence on other nations. Eugenics attracted followers from every political position. However, one trajectory for the science led to the legitimation of Nazi racial policies. As George Mosse notes in his book, Toward the Final Solution, A History of European Racism, in 1934, Carl Pearson welcomed Hitler's racial policy as an attempt to regenerate Germany. Galton then was an influential pioneer of race science. He takes his place in historical accounts of modern anti-Semitism, not least those which explore the etiology of Nazi anti-Semitism. Yet, the story of Galton's Jewish boy is less straightforward than this narrative suggests. For in Galton's work on the Jewish composite, he had a significant co-worker. Indeed, it was not Galton, but his co-worker who first hit on the idea that the two men should mount an expedition to the Jews' Free School in Whitechapel to create the photographs. This co-worker was someone who believed not only in the religious, but also in the racial distinctiveness of the Jews. In his scientific work, he analyzed and augmented the anthropometrical statistics that were the stuff of late Victorian race science. He measured heads and took a host of other physical measurements. He investigated whether Jews were more prone to disease than other races. And he tried to measure the distribution of Jewish ability relative to other races. This man was the Jewish intellectual Joseph Jacobs. Jacobs had been born in Australia in 1854. He arrived in England in 1872. 4 years later, he graduated from Cambridge. In London, he joined a circle of Jewish journalists, academics, and men of letters that included the novelist Israel Zangwill, the journalist Lucien Wolfe, and the Judaic scholar Israel Abrahams. Individually and collectively, they strived to animate Jewish culture in England and to explain Jews to the non-Jewish world around them. Jacobs wrote on medieval Jewish history, but at the same time gained recognition as a literary critic, an anthropologist, and an expert on folklore. The collaboration between Galton and Jacobs brings together histories that usually we consider separately, even divergently. On the one hand, there is Galton, a key figure who helped to shape racial science, who regarded the Jews as a race, and who did not like what he saw. Jacobs, on the other hand, is a significant, if neglected, figure in the history of Jewish life in Britain. The collaboration between the two men is a point of intersection between histories of the Jews and the history of anti-Semitism. And it is just one of numerous examples where the two narratives touch and overlap. These points of convergence have been noticed before, but they have not engaged the attention of historians of anti-Semitism. This blind spot, I want to suggest, is symptomatic of how more generally the history of anti-Semitism is written. It is characteristic of both the reach of the field as it developed and its limitations. Above all, what I have in mind here are those several volumes that declare themselves to be histories of anti-Semitism and try to provide an account of that phenomenon over centuries and in many cases across countries. Here, among historians, there is a striking consensus. It is one that can be found, for example, in the work of Robert Wistrich, who is probably the most visible and prolific historian of anti-Semitism in the world today. Wistrich emphasizes a great continuity in the history of anti-Semitism, which he traces back to the Hellenistic period. But he, like others, shows that from the 4th century, a malign image of the Jews became a central motif for the Church Fathers. The Jews were now convicted of deicide and presented as performing the devil's work. Wistrich argues that this, more than anything else, accounts for the pervasiveness and the content of anti-Semitism today. It is the major achievement of work by Wistrich and others, that they insist that we reckon with animosity to Jews over centuries, even millennia. But other elements in this analysis are more questionable. The first of these is the idea that anti-Semitism is a unique phenomenon which defies parallels and comparisons. Its singularity arises because, according to these historians, the very existence of Jews generates anti-Semitism. According to Wistrich, the reason why anti-Semitism is different from all other forms of xenophobia and prejudice is because of the unique character of the Jewish diaspora, its unique social cohesion, compactness, and religiously sanctioned exclusiveness. There are two dubious ideas lurking here. First, that Jews ultimately are responsible for anti-Semitism, and secondly, that the history of anti-Semitism is unconnected with other forms of exclusion. A further questionable feature in these accounts of anti-Semitism is the account that the phenomenon is to be explained primarily as a form of prejudice. For Wistrich, anti-Semitism amounts to a series of myths, stereotypes, fantasies, and obsessions. Anti-Semitism, for these historians, arises from a failure of cognition. It is the malign triumph of unreason. Reflection on the unconscious and on fantasy can add to our understanding of anti-Semitism, but the concept of prejudice, nevertheless, makes a poor starting point for historians because it prevents us from adopting the procedures historians normally employ when studying people whose beliefs and practices were different from our own. As a first step, historians normally will try to understand the concepts that shape the worldview of people who lived before us. This means that when we find them communicating their beliefs, we take those beliefs seriously as an attempt to understand the world and to live instrumentally within it. Moreover, historians will also try to discover the connections between any one idea and the wider contexts of beliefs and practices that help sustain it and give it explanatory power and meaning. If we return to Galton and Jacobs and their underlying ideas, we can identify a common set of assumptions about the existence of races and a desire to understand the influence of these biological collectivities on social behavior and well-being. Jacobs not only worked with Galton on his composite photographs, he was sufficiently influenced by him to follow his attempt to investigate hereditary genius. Hereditary Genius was the title of a book Galton published in 1869, and in 1886, Jacobs applied these methods to compare how many eminent men of certain rank exist in each million Englishmen and of Jews. He discovered that Jews were superior as actors, chess players, musicians, poets, and metaphysicians. For any Jewish parents here this evening who hope their children may attend university, this is a depressing list and may lead you to wonder whether, from occupations such as these, your children will ever be able to repay their university fees. You may then be relieved to know that Jacobs also found that Jews excelled as financiers and doctors. Galton, Jacobs, and others were engaged in a common pursuit, an attempt to establish the scientific reality of race and to understand its significance for social behavior. From the perspective of the early 21st century, one or both of these Victorian gentlemen may seem prejudiced. But in saying this, all we do is erect our own beliefs as a universal standard against which to measure them. This will help us to judge them according to our own contingent criteria, but it will not help us to understand them as people who lived more than a century ago. If we are to understand the history of animosity towards Jews, we need not only see the phenomenon in all of its historical durability, we also need to explore the ways in which it made sense to the people who held this animus at any one point in time, and how anti-Semitism articulated with other beliefs these people held. The concept of prejudice gets in the way of doing this. With this in mind, and in the remainder of this lecture, I want to talk about the ways in which Jews figured in political controversy between the 18th century Jew Bill and the unprecedented mass immigration of East European Jews more than a century later. The Jew Bill of 1753 enabled foreign-born Jews to naturalize as British subjects. It was brought forward at the request of a handful of Sephardi merchants and brokers in London. Like other foreign traders, the Jews among them were required to pay special duties, such as discriminatory custom rates and special port fees. In addition, they were disqualified from engaging in colonial trade or from holding land or a share in a British sailing vessel. Any foreign trader who wanted to circumvent these regulations could do so by naturalizing as an English subject, but this avenue was closed to Jews because it required applicants to receive the Anglican sacrament. The only other path available to foreign-born Jews was to apply for the status of a denizen. Yet this was hardly satisfactory, since not only was it expensive, it also left many disabilities in place, including the alien tutors. In 1753, one of the most prominent of the Sephardi merchants, Joseph Salvador, wrote to the Duke of Newcastle, setting out a case for a change in the law. The Duke of Newcastle was a man of immense political durability and influence, and he was also brother of the Prime Minister, Henry Pelham. The government had good reason to be grateful to London's Jewish financiers, who had subscribed loans in the 1740s during the War of Austrian Succession, and who had loyally helped to restore the government's credit after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. Accordingly, Newcastle and Pelham were obliging, and in April 1753 introduced a bill to the House of Lords to allow professing Jews who had lived in Britain for 3 years to naturalize without receiving the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Less than 2 months later, the bill had passed into law. This victory was short-lived. When Parliament reconvened in November 1753, the Duke of Newcastle immediately introduced a second bill to repeal the earlier measure. This was a poor outcome for the Jews and a humiliation for Newcastle, who nevertheless calculated that repeal was a less bad outcome than the losses that would surely follow in the general election due just a few months later. The original Jew bill had provoked some resistance as it made its way through Parliament, but only once it had passed into law did the full torrent of opposition fall down upon it, its supporters and the Jews. Indeed, the Jew bill proved to be the most controversial piece of legislation in mid-18th century Britain. The opposition press, led by the London Evening Post, seized on the issue and attacked the bill almost daily. Country newspapers all over the land reproduced and broadcast items from the London campaign. Draftsmen provided a stream of satirical prints on the subject. The campaign against the bill was underpinned by the idea that there was an essential and ineradicable difference between Christians and unconverted Jews. In Parliament, Sir Edward Isham, the Tory member for Northamptonshire, explained that unlike German Protestants or Huguenots, the unconverted Jews can never be incorporated with us and will always deem themselves to be of the Hebrew, not the English nation. Less politely, in the London Evening Post, a correspondent writing under the moniker Old England went further. Had there been a law to inoculate the leprosy upon every man, woman and child throughout His Majesty's British dominions, there had been less to complain of than of this impure conjunction with Jewish blood at the expense of all that can be called Christian among us. This idea of difference came with historical baggage. The newspaper recycled tales of Jewish cruelty from past times, including the ritual murder of Christian children. Jews were also represented as inherently disloyal subjects and as rapacious, griping usurers who get vast estates by plundering the public. These statements did not draw any distinction between those foreign Jews who might seek to naturalize as Englishmen and those thousands of Jews living in Georgian England who were the king's natural-born subjects. All Jews were deemed to be equally unassimilable. It is understandable, then, why some historians have regarded this propaganda as testimony to the continuing force of a vicious image of the Jew that can be traced back to the Middle Ages. While this interpretation does draw our attention to a legacy of medieval Jewish discourse and persecution, it does not help us to understand why this inheritance continued to make sense and to be drawn upon in the very different cultural and social conditions of mid-18th century England. The starting point for much of this campaign was the commonplace notion that the British polity was founded on Protestant Christianity. The Glorious Revolution had protected Britain from the ecclesiastical tyranny of Roman Catholicism. Anti-Catholicism, indeed, was a vital component of British patriotism in the 18th century. This commonplace attitude was given a particular inflection by opposition Tories who venerated the established church and did not trust the Whig ministers to do the same. To them, the idea of naturalizing Jews was absurd and undermined the vital connections between church and state. This view suffused the pamphlets, prints, and newspapers that carried forth opposition to Jewish naturalization. Often, the propaganda took the form of a burlesque. It presented a world turned upside down in which the cherished symbols of national and religious identity, the two being closely related, would be subverted by Jews if the naturalization bill remained law. In this propaganda, St. Paul's became a synagogue, Parliament a Sanhedrin. Every diocese has its rabbi, and the country is entangled in wars against a league of Christian states, and one John Hartwell is publicly whipped outside Duke's Place Synagogue for speaking disrespectfully of the coming of the Messiah. These travesties worked because they built on a shared understanding of national identity that excluded the Jews. In this context, circumcision was a frequent topic of fun. The Evening Post regularly carried mock announcements advertising the practice. Moses Ben Amri, surgeon, at his house near Moorgate, begs leave to inform the public that he circumcises, capitalized, in the safest, easiest, and most expeditious manner. MPs who supported the Jew bill were imagined undergoing the rite with inevitably painful consequences. But the jokes had a serious purpose because they alluded to the way in which the circumcised penis was reckoned to be an embodied sign of the Jews' essential difference. The power of the graphic prints lay in their capacity to convey several of these messages all at once, and this can be seen in the satirical print reproduced here, Vox Populi Vox Dei, or the Jew Bill repealed. It was drawn, as the title suggests, to celebrate the repeal of the naturalization bill. It illustrates the victory of patriotism and Christianity over the Jews and their Whig supporters. At the back is a view of London, preserved, and next to it is Calvary. In the divine balance, to the right are the Gospels and the Magna Carta, and they outweigh the bribery money and the Naturalization Act. The cross is being threatened by a crowd of Jews, with the financier Samuel Gideon and the deist Lord Bolingbroke at their front. But these enemies have been defeated, and the paraphernalia of Judaism, including a circumcision knife, are left strewn on the field. What we have here is not only the expression of a set of beliefs about national identity and religious identity, but a political battle. This debate was about power, but not only the power of Christians over Jews, but also of Whigs over Tories. The Jew Bill was used by opposition Tory politicians to organize a challenge to the ministry. For Tories, the Jew Bill raised the issue of religion and the standing of the Church of England in a way that had been absent from politics for 3 decades. Indeed, the issue had been absent because Whig ministers understood its explosive potential. The Jew Bill provided a rare moment when the Whigs' opponents found an issue for Tory attitudes to find expression. In the constituencies, the Tories used the clamour to turn popular opinion against the ministry. According to the Post, the Jew Bill was the great issue in the coming election. This political context is vital if we are to understand the meaning and the dynamics of debate in 1753. It helps to account for what is otherwise mysterious, why the Jewish issue disappeared from public debate as rapidly as it had erupted. Nevertheless, the outcome in 1753 signaled a notable victory for the view that, despite superficial similarities, Jews were indeed fundamentally different from non-Jews. Just over 100 years later, Lionel de Rothschild became the first professing Jew to take a seat in the House of Commons. Until that date, Jews had been effectively barred from Parliament by the requirement that anyone elected by a constituency swear an oath of loyalty on the true faith of a Christian. Rothschild had been elected for the City of London constituency on 3 previous occasions and had been unable to take his seat. David Salomons was elected for Greenwich in 1851, and though he did manage to vote on one occasion, he was finally ejected by the Sergeant-at-Arms. In fact, in 1858, wording was only agreed for Rothschild's particular case. It was only in 1866 that a new Oaths Act was passed. It was in 1830 that the Jews had once again become a focus for political debate, one focus for political debate. In that year, Robert Grant first introduced a bill to the Commons, which, had it passed into law, would have removed all Jewish disabilities. By this point, the charge of deicide was heard less frequently, and jokes about circumcision had fallen victim to the conservative reformation of manners following the French Revolution. Nevertheless, the view that Jews were fundamentally different from Christians remained alive. Opposing Grant's bill, the Solicitor General, Edward Sugden, maintained Jews were not Englishmen. They had a peculiar character stamped on them by their own institutions. They were severed by them from all other people. They could not form a part of any society in which they might be mingled. Above all, family ties formed the real bonds of society, and the Jews, by their practice of endogamy, refused to enter into them. Rothschild's entry into Parliament signalled a momentous defeat for this view, but as we shall see, not a decisive one. The case for the Jews' legal equality was predicated on the view that differences between Jews and Christians were superficial only. Equality for Jews and Christians within the Constitution followed from the more profound assertion that Jews and Christians were equal in a more fundamental sense. When reform of Jewish disabilities was first introduced to Parliament in 1830, it is notable how many of its supporters, Robert Grant, Sir James Mackintosh, Henry Brougham, Lord John Russell, Daniel O'Connell, and Thomas Babington Macaulay, were all well known for their opposition to slavery. It is no coincidence that Grant's bill was introduced just as the campaign against slavery in the British colonies was reaching its climax. For Grant, persecution of the Jews, like slavery, was a blot on the Christian conscience and an affront to the Almighty. He introduced his bill with a history lesson detailing the persecution of Jews in medieval England. It was difficult to say whether they suffered more from the mad, malignant fury of the populace or from the rapacious tyranny of the sovereigns. The disabilities under which they continued to live, he said, were a continuing injustice. He concluded by enjoining the House to do justice and to love mercy. The Jews, it seemed, were imagined to occupy a position similar to that of the supplicating slave, asking if he was not a man and brother too. Some, but by no means all, evangelicals took Grant's side. But there were other routes to regarding the Jews as equal. These were exemplified by the arguments brought forward by the Whig essayists and historians such as such as James Mackintosh and Thomas Babington Macaulay. Macaulay stated the case for the Jews' legal equality on utilitarian grounds. Every man has a right to all that may conduce to his pleasure if it does not inflict pain on anyone else, he announced. Mackintosh, unlike his younger friend, did not put his faith in what he called the selfish system, but in moral sentiments and disinterested virtuous action. But this led him to a similar conclusion. He supported Grant's bill on the ground of religious liberty, completing the work begun by the repeal in 1828 on the disabilities on Protestant dissenters and on Catholics in 1829. But the case for the Jews' equality, though ultimately victorious in political terms, was also limited. First, we should note its supporters were not Democrats. In general, they were vigorous supporters of the Great Reform Act of 1832, which connected the franchise more clearly than ever to the principle of male property ownership. The working classes were to be excluded because, as the revolutions in France and agitation at home had demonstrated, the poor were vulnerable to agitators, and under their influence, they endangered property. The argument for Jewish equality was in fact an argument for the equality not of British Jews in general, but of property-owning men among them. These Jews, like the middle classes more broadly, were entitled to the benefits of reform because they met a set of prescribed standards. To meet these standards, Jews were expected to become less Jewish. The Whig essayists and historians Mackintosh and Macaulay and a host of other supporters of the Jews' equality attributed the Jews' faults, their warped character, to persecution. Mackintosh and Macaulay saw human nature as a product of society and emphasized the degree to which it was formed by historical circumstances. Insofar as Jews were different from Christians, they argued, this was the outcome of the contingent conditions that overlay a more fundamental similarity. The essayist William Hazlitt made the point with characteristic clarity. We throw in the teeth of the Jews, he wrote, that they are prone to certain sordid vices. If they are vicious, it is we who have made them so. You tear people up by the roots and trample on them like noxious weeds, and then make an outcry that they do not take root in the soil like wholesome plants. For Mackintosh, this argument took on a particular class character. On the one side, there were those Jews, merchants of great credit, possessing vast wealth and filling a highly respectable station of society. These Jews, Mackintosh stated, deserved emancipation. As for the lower classes of Jews, they could only be reclaimed and reformed if we took away the moral brand which had doomed them to continue their malpractices. In this light, it is significant how Macaulay's famous speeches and essays on Jewish emancipation are littered with negative and stereotypical images of the Jews' financial power and their hidden influence over the fate of nations and empires. For Macaulay, the ostensible point was to demonstrate the absurdity of denying the Jews political rights, since they possessed so much economic power. Nevertheless, he showed he was keenly aware of the Jews' difference. This perception extended to his private life. Following an anti-slavery ball held at the home of a wealthy Jewish family, he wrote to one of his sisters, complaining of Jewesses by dozens, Jews by scores. And though he left early, he lay awake. The sound of fiddles was in my ears, and gaudy dresses and black hair and Jewish noses fluctuating up and down before mine eyes. Macaulay's combination of ardent support for Jewish emancipation with happy disdain for real Jews and his use of a crude image of Jewish financial power once again illustrates, as does the collaboration between Galton and Jacobs, that the history of anti-Semitism cannot be separated easily from other, more congenial narratives. For these supporters of legal equality, the Jews' differences were the product of history and did not reflect an essential Jewish character. But at the same time, they regarded those differences as both extensive and unwelcome. There was a tension within the emancipation argument, an argument between a commitment to universalism on one side and an outspoken apprehension of the Jews' difference on the other. And this was all the more significant because over the next decades, contrary to the hopes and expectations of the emancipationists, the Jews' differences from their Christian neighbors and fellow subjects became only more visible. The Jews' continuing endogamy remained an obstacle for many, as did circumcision, which was condemned by its critics as an example of the Jews' narrow and primeval tribalism. The Jews' connection with loan-mongering and the expanding stock exchange became still more marked. At mid-century, there were 864 members of the stock exchange. By 1877, this figure had risen to 2,000, at least 5% of whom were Jews. Given that Jews comprised just 0.25% of the entire population, this strikingly disproportionate involvement in the city presented a difficult question regarding the Jews' continued economic distinctiveness. Equally significant was the figure of Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli, you will know, was born a Jew, and at the age of 13, baptized as an Anglican. It was he who led the Conservative rebellion against Peel in 1846, and who became Prime Minister briefly in 1868, and again between 1874 and 1880. His actions as Prime Minister, especially his support for Ottoman rule over Christian Bulgarians when the latter rose up in their struggle for national independence in 1876, was hugely divisive. The revolt was brutally suppressed by the Turkish militia, the notorious Bashi Bazouks. When news of the murder of 25,000 innocents reached London, along with stories of rape and destruction, it provoked a massive campaign of indignation led by William Gladstone. Disraeli, by contrast, stood by Britain's long-standing strategic support for the Ottoman Empire and responded to the reported horrors with ostentatious insouciance. Inevitably, the question arose why Disraeli was pursuing a policy that aligned Britain with tyranny against liberty, with barbarity against humanity, and with Islam against Christianity. For many, the answer lay in the fact that despite his baptism, he remained a Jew. He was, in the words of the journalist Henry Dunkley, a Jew by birth and a Christian by accident. According to Gladstone, Dis's crypto-Judaism was at work. For some, the key lay in Disraeli's Hebraic indifference to Christian morality. For others, it lay in his Jewish blood. Many times, the two perspectives were combined. Disraeli was presented as a grotesque foreign accident in English history. And in the picture, you see Squire John Bull, overlooked by Gladstone, evicting a very Jewish-looking Disraeli from his job as bailiff, as indeed he was evicted, as it were, in the election of 1880. Inevitably, the fire aimed at Disraeli fell on Jews more generally. On occasion, we can see the development of a more elaborate theory of Jewish conspiracy that implicated the interests of Jewish investors who helped finance the Turkish debt and the Jews who owned parts of the pro-Turkish press. Lastly, as we take account of developments that confounded the hopes of many of the Jews' liberal friends, in the years that immediately followed Disraeli's premiership, the Jewish population in London, and above all of the East End of London, was swollen by tens of thousands of East European Jews. The immigrants displayed in spades all those features that Mackintosh had found so objectionable 50 years earlier. To be sure, in the case of the Russian Jews, as with the English Jews before them, it was possible to ascribe to the immigrants' unappealing behavior and beliefs to a legacy of persecution in Russia, and many did so. but for others, the immigrants represented the authentic and insurmountable difference of the Jew. They were marked out by their denigrated language, Yiddish, their archaic religious traditions, and their apparent willingness to accept industrial conditions English workmen would find intolerable. I have argued then that there was a tension within the emancipation case that lay between a commitment to universalism and the perception that Jews were, for the moment at least, not like other people. The concept of race addressed this tension. The term race could mean many things in Victorian Britain. Often it was used as a synonym for what today we would call a nation or an ethnic group. Sometimes race was used to refer to classes, both the aristocracy and the poor. But whenever the term was used, it connected social groups to their biological forebears. The concept of race was helpful to conservatives and radicals who wanted to contest the doctrine of equality that underpinned Jewish emancipation and a host of other reform movements. It was seized on by Disraeli, for example. Disraeli condemned equality as the most pernicious doctrine of modern times. And accordingly, and idiosyncratically, it was on account of the Jews' extraordinary genius, not on account of their similarity to other Englishmen, that Disraeli argued that Rothschild should be admitted to Parliament. Unlike Disraeli, Robert Knox was a radical, a Republican, and an opponent of colonialism. But for Knox, too, equality was an illusion. In The Races of Man, published in 1850, Knox claimed that notwithstanding their common origin, races now formed permanent varieties. These varieties, he insisted, displayed anatomical differences, and the human mind differed in correspondence with these corporeal variations. Knox's radicalism made him not a universalist, but a national revolutionary. He understood English history, as well as European history more generally, as an expression of racial determinism. He looked forward to a revolution that would complete the work of 1688, when the Saxon race had only partially overthrown the evil effects of the conquest of England by the Normans. However, the concept of race was also taken up by liberals and reformers. We can see this at work in the anti-Semitism of the campaign against Disraeli and the Jews in the late 1870s. In the battle for Jewish equality, the Jews had been supported by men and women who saw themselves carrying forward a program of moral reform. Just as the causes of Jewish emancipation and anti-slavery were carried forward in the 1830s, so too the nonconformists, radicals, and liberal intellectuals who provided support for the Bulgarian agitation expected to find the Jews alongside them in this, the next battle for liberty, humanity, and conscience. Their disappointment was bitter, and the doctrine of race enabled them to make sense of it. Goldwin Smith, a long-standing advocate of liberal causes, cried out against the Jewish influence on British foreign policy under Disraeli. Emancipation, he argued, had been an error. It had been wrong to regard the Judaism as just another form of religious nonconformity. Judaism is a religion of race, he argued. The rest of mankind are to the genuine Jew not merely people holding a different creed, but aliens in blood. This turn to race as an explanation for the persistence of difference and the apparent failure of emancipated groups to rise to the challenge of equality can be found elsewhere. As Catherine Hall has demonstrated, the economic decline of plantations in the Caribbean, the demise of the sugar industry, and the flight of former slaves led a new generation of reformers to dwell on the persistence of difference there and to use the concept of race as the explanation. Closer to home, and as early as the 1830s, urban reformers such as James Kay found an explanation for the crime, disease, and disorder of Manchester and other industrial cities in the racial infection brought by the Irish. There was no radical rupture between the universalism of the early 19th century and race theory. Rather, the latter was used to try to resolve the contradictions and dilemmas that emerged from the former. These same compromises registered in the world of learned societies as well as in politics. On the face of it, Darwin's insistence on the common descent of the human races, of the human race, was at odds with race theory. However, as Eveline Richards has pointed out, this should not blind us to the convergence of Knoxian and Darwinian thinking on race. In The Descent of Man, published in 1871, Darwin argued that racial traits had arisen in the prehistory of mankind, and because they were not biologically adaptive, were relatively fixed. Like Knox, Darwin argued that competition and survival was carried forward by races, not individuals. T.H. Huxley, an early and fierce advocate for Darwinism, in 1865 wrote in support of the emancipation of the slaves in the United States, but also acknowledged that the highest places in the hierarchy of civilization will assuredly not be within reach of our dusky cousins. It was Huxley who in 1871 helped to create the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland, and thus engineered a merger between the Knoxians of the Anthropological Society and their Darwinian competitors. These affinities are important for our understanding of the idea of race in Victorian Britain, but they have a particular significance for this lecture because it was to Huxley's Anthropological Institute that Jacob Joseph delivered his lecture, Joseph Jacobs, delivered his lecture on the racial characteristics of the modern Jews. Jacobs, an avowed Darwinian, provides an interesting insight into the tensions between universalism and difference that led him to embrace race theory. He wrote in 1891, "Something that develops is obviously different from its own development, which is all that Darwinism professes to explain. It is the essence of the matter, the thing as in itself it really is, that we seek for." Jacobs' paper on the Jews' racial characteristics was the outcome of his search for this essence. He brought forward historical and anatomical evidence to make his case, but the photographs provided vital confirmation. He wrote, "In these Jewish composites, we have the nearest representation we can hope to possess of the lad Samuel as he ministered before the ark, or the youthful David when he tended his father's sheep." As this suggests, Jacobs endowed the Jews' racial singularity with a solely religious significance, one that lay in the Jews' gift of monotheism and the moral edifice that Jewish civilization had built. The significance of the Jewish race was thus universal as well as particular. In 1891, he explained that he had embarked on his racial studies of the Jews more than a decade earlier, I quote, when the anti-Semitic movement was at its height. His anthropological work was one long answer to the anti-Semites. Although the Jews' religious mission was underpinned by race, the Jews' other characteristics, he argued, were the outcome of environment and education. In view of the thousands of East European Jews arriving in London annually, there was a pressing lesson that Jacobs drew here. No better plan could be suggested for the foreign Jews than to follow in the footsteps of their English-born predecessors. The immediate problem before the Jews of London, he stated boldly, is to anglicize their foreign brethren. The problem was that change would take time. National character is of slow growth and equally slow to change, he observed. Jacobs was an activist as well as an intellectual. In 1882, he became secretary of the Russian Jewish Committee, formed to administer the charitable fund to support Russian Jewish refugees. As part of his work for this committee, Jacobs produced a Yiddish-English phrasebook to help the immigrants adapt to their new environment. As secretary, however, he was also instrumental in pursuing the policy of repatriation that the committee implemented in the face of mass immigration. In all, the Russian Jewish Committee sent 7,500 Jews back to Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1906. The Jewish Board of Guardians, the principal communal charity, sent back a further 24,000 in the same years. According to one charitable worker, those sent home were refused all other assistance and simply starved into accepting a ticket out of the country. There was a connection between Jacobs' analysis of the Jews' adaptability and this policy of repatriation. For the immigrants sent home were those judged to be the least fit, the least able to adapt. Joseph Jacobs, then, was a race theorist who was implicated in policies that returned thousands of poor Jews to countries in which they suffered extensive legal discrimination as well as periodic outbursts of popular fury. None of this makes him an anti-Semite, but it does illustrate why, as I argued at the outset of this lecture, we should reconsider the way we understand anti-Semitism. Jacobs was concerned with the Jews' difference, with defining and understanding it, and when confronted with Russian Jews in London, with attenuating it. He was just one among many in this period who tried to reconcile their belief in equality and universalism with their perception and understanding of the Jews' difference. This common terrain of debate was occupied by anti-Semites, by Jews, and many people who were neither of these things. This history suggests that we should be less concerned with a narrowly defined search for lineages of anti-Semitism, but that instead we should explore how the Jews' difference from non-Jews was understood at different moments and how this changed over time. In doing so, we will be better placed to understand anti-Semitism when it arises and understand it as an integral part of the European past, rather than as a pathology that can only be accounted for by its own special form of explanation. We will be better placed to understand how significant both contemplating and doing something about the Jewish problem has been for both Jews and non-Jews. Jacobs' activity is significant in a second sense, because it reminds us that Jews play a part in this story. This is not because Jews were in some ultimate sense the cause of anti-Semitism, but because Jews as well as non-Jews grappled with the problem of difference. Histories of anti-Semitism inevitably place Jews as victims, and of course, in many cases, that tragically is what they were. But they were also historical actors in their own right, participants in their words and deeds in the debate on the nature and boundaries of the Jews' differences, what they were, and what they should be. Finally, we have seen that the history of anti-Semitism is closely connected to other forms of exclusion. Whether or not anti-Semitism is a unique hatred, as others have maintained, we can see that it never rose in isolation, but was always connected to other forms of racism and other forms of exclusion. In the 18th century, the opponents of Jewish naturalization also opposed naturalizing foreigners more generally and were the fount of anti-Catholicism. In the 19th century, as we have seen, the oscillation between support for equality and the apprehension of difference did not arise in relation to the Jews alone. Of course, not all differences were the same or had the same consequences. It mattered whether one was a working-class Jew or a wealthy one. And in some context, it also mattered that Jews were white. Most Jews in the late 19th century were ardent imperialists. Greeting the Queen's Jubilee in 1897, Israel Abrahams, Joseph Jacobs' friend, offered a paean of praise to the empire and its capacity to embrace men of different races, but not, we might add, under the same condition of civic equality, that British Jews enjoyed. The relationship between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and exclusion is not only a historical question, it is also an urgent issue in the present. 60 years ago, scholars and activists concerned with anti-Semitism and racism were engaged in dialogue and in many cases worked together. These points of dialogue and cooperation have not vanished, but they are now thin on the ground. They have become so for a mixture of intellectual and political reasons. But the absence of dialogue weakens our understanding of both anti-Semitism and of racism, and hence our capacity to combat both. The Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism will engage in a wide range of activities within and beyond Birkbeck, but at the core of many of them will be an attempt to revivify this dialogue as a way of not only to understanding the past, but also to make a contribution, I hope, to change for good in the present. Thank you very much indeed.
To thank David for a wonderful lecture, and just to underline very, very briefly, because he's spoken and we don't want to delay proceedings much longer, but just to underline one or two points where I think what he says points the way to, I think, a new understanding of the phenomena that we've been talking about. What he wants to underline, and I think he demonstrated very well in the lecture how that might happen, is a new direction, a new historical way of understanding what has traditionally been called anti-Semitism. As he points out, existing studies, and by that I think we mean particularly studies which have been prevalent since the Second World War, basically, have emphasized 3 points which he wanted to highlight. One is that anti-Semitism might be thought of as a continuous and single strand, and that a single story, as it were, or narrative, could be told about it from the Hellenistic period to right now. A second point is that this story is like no other story. It's a unique story, that there aren't really any other people with whom this experience could be exchanged. One or two people have mentioned the Armenians, but of course it doesn't quite stretch to the millennia or pointed to by historians of anti-Semitism. And the third and important thing which he stressed, which characterizes a lot of these historical studies of anti-Semitism, has been this notion of prejudice. And I think what he's very valuably highlighted is that both the word anti-Semitism itself and prejudice are not, as it were, historical words. They're not words, in other words, which historians would find easy to fit in to the way in which we understand history today. Because the way we understand history today very much thinks about discourses, it thinks in pluralistic terms rather than single terms, and it tries to find ways of comparing experiences, which it's particularly enabled to do through the resources of cultural and intellectual history, and to show that we're not talking about a single set of feelings which emerge every so often or get inflamed every so often. We're talking about a series of discourses in which Jews might occupy. And I want to suggest that by making that emphasis, what David is doing is really moving anti-Semitism from, as it were, the sidelines, not so much of world history, but of British history, to much more to the centre. Because what we nowadays think of is not that Britain has a single island story, which, as it were, then what happened to the Jews in Britain can either be a facet of modest congratulation or modest embarrassment, but on either respect, it doesn't quite fit the Arthur Bryant sort of story of what Britain is about. Well, I think that has very much changed in the last 30 or 40 years. When we think, particularly, one milestone, to use a currently employed word, which ought to be mentioned, is the work of John Pocock, and thinking about Britain being a four-island or more-island story, and Britain being a construct. And once you start thinking of it in that way, then this question about negotiating difference becomes absolutely central to the way we want to understand the history of Britain, and of course, by extension, that of other countries. And in that sense, Jews, like Scots, Irish, Welsh, etc., all have negotiation that they have to make with a culture or a state which they are in relation with, and that sort of relationship is, as it were, periodically conflictual, inflammatory, sometimes latent, etc., etc. Again, I want to, following David, just undermine the idea that there is some sort of single discourse in which is anti-Semitic, which just, as it were, emerges every so often. And just to stress the difference between two or three of them, the first, of course, which David mentioned, is, particularly if we're thinking about 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, that Britain was a Protestant country with a Protestant constitution. And between 1688 and 1828, when Parliament reluctantly had to give up the idea, that was very much the defining way in which Britain was thought about by a lot of people, and it, as David has shown, was very much the weapon used to sort of knock down the proposal of the Jew Bill in 1753. It's also worth stressing that this Protestant constitution idea and the biblical basis, or the alleged biblical basis of the British polity, was not altogether inimical to the position of the Jews. In the 1650s, in Cromwell, apparently, one of the deciding features in welcoming Jews back to Britain under the Commonwealth was that, according to I think the book of Revelation, I'm not sure, the Jews have to be there on the day of judgment. And clearly, if they're not in Britain, how on earth could that day of judgment come? So you had to have some Jews there to do it. So, in other words, they did take this Protestant constitution very seriously. Another discourse, which is not, it overlaps, of course, but it is rather different, is one which David also alluded to, which concerns race and class. It's interesting that Marx, in talking about his history as class struggle, said, of course, I didn't invent the idea, and he more or less says it's invented by Guizot and some other historians in France after 1815. Guizot said the history of France has been the history of a struggle between two classes for 13 centuries, and in the French Revolution, finally, one of these classes beat the other. But those two classes were the Gauls and the Franks. And so the idea of race and class being very distinct and different terms, I think, is mistaken in the 19th century. And certainly, of course, it has its analogue in Britain, where we have the Saxons and the Normans and the Norman yoke. And again, Jews come into that story because it was the Normans, as it were, who brought back the Jews in the first place to Britain, to England, I should say, in 1066. And if we fast forward to the 19th century, we find this very strong obsession with the Anglo-Saxon liberties, Anglo-Saxon customs. And one of the prime historians was a man called Edward Freeman, who wrote a whole history of the Norman conquest. He's also one of the prime opponents of Disraeli. And again, this sort of idea that there's something Hebraic about Normans, about liberty, etc., etc. We have to remember too, just as a footnote, again about what David's doing to not have just the simple story of anti-Semitism, to see that even in the mid-19th century, we're not talking about a simple question. We're talking about a question which involves the Ottoman Empire, Russia, the so-called, as well as the question of the Bulgarian atrocities and Beaconsfield, or Jews and Christians. We're also talking about Islam. We're talking about a multifaceted conflict in which Jews were given a role and also played prominent roles. Again, we shouldn't think there were simple issues. Another issue, another area again where I think one could point to a different sort of set of discourses which were involved, and that is the question of race and culture. Sometimes blood, too. There isn't this, as David finally said, there isn't this straightforward division between a biological approach and a cultural approach. I'll just give you two examples. One would be, of course, Matthew Arnold and his conflict with Hebraism. There would be also, this is just to give another example, would be Marx writing to Lafargue, saying, talking about his daughter who's being paid court to by Lafargue, saying, you know, your Latin blood may mean that you can't restrain yourself. I beg you to do so. The point is that there was a sort of connection between biology and culture, and it's one which historians have yet to fully, I think, investigate. But again, it shows that when people thought about the Jews, they didn't just think about religion or about race. They thought very often various combinations between the two. And that's really just to emphasize what David has done, which is to replace these former histories, which were very worthy and made some very valuable contributions in their time, by now, I think, a much more sophisticated way of thinking about how to situate Jews and their difference and the animosity against them at various periods, instead of thinking of this as some sort of sui generis history which allows no comparison. So I'd like to conclude just by thanking David very much and congratulating him on what I think is a truly superb lecture.